WoofDen.
Welcome. I'm Bill WoofDriver Helman.
And I'm Andrew Hager. Welcome to the WoofDen. This is our weekly podcast where we discuss dogs, dog adventuring, all sorts of animal-related things. And today's topic is actually one that's very dear to my heart. It's the Presidential Pet Museum. Bill, you're the director of the Presidential Pet Museum. I'm the historian in residence at the Presidential Pet Museum. So I think it's only natural that we would do an episode devoted entirely to the museum itself. And, the first question I always get when I tell people that I work for the Pet Museum is, oh, the Presidential Pet Museum is a real thing? I don't know if you get that, but that happens to me all the time. So I guess that was also my first reaction when I heard about it. And so I'm kind of wondering, what was your first reaction, or how did you hear about this? Can you tell us sort of the process by which you came to become the director of the Presidential Pet Museum?
Sure. Well, I do. First, I want to touch on, I get a kick out of everybody's like, what? What are you talking about? Presidential pets. And a lot of people relate it automatically to the president that's in office now, but obviously it spans all of the presidents from the beginning, George Washington, where there were more, and you can touch more on this, Andrew, where there were more working animals, to the last president, which was Barack Obama, who had animals for more companionship. But I came into this because I call myself a dog adventurer. I'm a dog lover first. But dog adventurer is where I take my dogs. I have Huskies, so I take them on all kinds of adventures where they're running in some way. Sometimes they're off leash, sometimes they're connected to a bicycle, etc. And we'll touch more into that. But I was on a website and I saw something about Presidential Pet Museum. It piqued my curiosity because I, like everybody else, had no idea what it was. I was able to contact further the owner of it, or the owners, and they were looking for someone to take it over because the woman that started it, Claire McLean, who is probably close to 90 now, or at least in her 80s, well into her 80s, she couldn't, I guess, grow it the way she had envisioned it as of late as she got older. She was originally a groomer. You have more of the history there, but she was originally a groomer for the Reagan's dogs.
For Lucky, the Bouvier.
Nancy and Ronald Reagan. And also Claire's mother was very politically savvy and motivated and into politics.
Okay.
And I think from the stories I remember, she had some contact with some of the presidents before Reagan. So there was a little bit of history with presidential interest in Claire's family. And I guess she learned from her mother, so it was passed on to her, that interest and history.
And that's interesting because that's one of the things I love about history. I mean, it's the passing down of the story of our people. And that... yes, it can come from a textbook. It can come from a long nonfiction Ron Chernow-style biography, but it starts with that oral tradition, with that somebody you know tells you a story, and it piques your interest, and that becomes your thing.
Totally. I can almost, I'm almost mesmerized sometimes when I'm adventuring with my dogs and I'm out on the trails, and if there's ever an elderly person that knows some of the history of the trail that we're at, when they come and tell you their story about it, or at least their view or what they know, because they usually know inside stuff. They might have known the families that lived along the trail in the 1800s, and those stories have been passed on, and when they tell you about them, it's like, it's pretty interesting, to say the least.
Well, yeah, it's like meeting a World War II veteran or something like that, and you talk to them and you get this story of something you've only read about. And, as a kid, it's not the kind of thing you appreciate as much, but the older I get, the more I appreciate hearing the stories of people who came before, probably because I'm thinking more about how I'm just going to be a story at some point. We're all just going to be stories. So you contacted Claire McLean and you agreed to take over the museum.
I actually contacted the gentleman that was kind of looking to rehome it. He worked with her and he kind of did the digital aspect of it.
Okay.
He ran the website and promoted it through the web, etc. And he was Claire's, in some regard, partner or point man, if you will. So when he found out who I was, he wanted to check me out and make sure that I had a genuine interest in animals and dogs and their welfare. He was really curious about that and wanted that to be one of the deciding factors, or it was going to be one of the deciding factors with him and Claire of who they were going to turn this museum over to.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. If you want somebody who loves history and somebody who loves animals. I mean, that's going to be your sweet spot.
Yes.
And that sort of fits you perfectly.
Thank you. Well, I love when people are so interested in what they're doing and so attached to it that when it's time for them to pass it on or do something with it, that they care so much enough to want to interview and want to know who they're giving this to. It's not just a financial aspect.
Yeah, it's not like you're working the cash register at McDonald's and it's somebody else's turn to stand there and ask about French fries. You know,
right,
this is not just punching a clock for these folks.
Right. But who would you get, you know, when you talk about a presidential pet museum, who could they get that would really be, I guess, well-versed in that field? Of course, a historian maybe, but is it an animal lover? I mean, it's kind of bridges a lot of different areas. So it's pretty cool that I ran into them and they ran into me, I guess.
And I think Ms. McLean's story is fascinating because you start, you know, obviously with this love of presidential history or history in general and politics, but then, you know, she's this groomer and she's grooming the Reagan's dog. And how did she describe it? There was like a shed on the White House lawn.
Yeah, she said actually, because I said, well, where'd you groom the dogs at? You know, it must be some fancy room in the White House. She said, oh no, they put me out back where there was a shed and they brought the dog to me and we did our business. And the dog went its way and I went my way. And I'm like, wow. I guess because of security concerns or whatever the case may be, there's business conducted in the White House. Maybe there wasn't room to do it. I don't know. But yeah.
Well, and it's probably also just for ease of cleaning. You know, you're grooming this giant Bouvier. I mean, because those are fairly large dogs. There's a lot of hair.
And Claire was I think she's still currently in some sort of alliance with Bouvier breeders. She was supposedly a world-renowned Bouvier breeder or associated with a world-renowned Bouvier breeder. And as recently as last year, the year before, something along those lines, she went to a Bouvier show to show some of her dogs.
Wow.
So, okay. So that was... I don't know if the love started with the Bouviers when she did the Reagan's dog or if she had always had that special place in her heart for that breed. But yeah.
Well, I love... The detail I always think of, aside from the shack on the White House grounds, is the fact that Claire kept some of the dog hair when she left. And that's something that, it's so old-fashioned. You know, like historically, hundreds of years ago, people would take locks of hair from people. You know, like, oh, Napoleon, can I have a lock of your hair? You know, and we don't really do that anymore. But it was kind of like she was doing that with this dog. You know, like,
she was.
This is my souvenir of this famous dog that I touched. And she used that hair to make these mixed media art paintings that became sort of the centerpiece of the early part of the museum's history.
That's correct, yeah.
And she was just kind of running the museum out of her house, right? In Maryland?
In Maryland, near D.C., like the suburbs of Maryland. D.C., Maryland, whatever you call it, they all kind of go together there.
Yeah.
But the story was when she had her first open house or opened the museum, there was a bus, or at least some point in the right around the time she opened it, there was a busload of people, and there was a line around the corner to her home to get access to the museum.
That would freak me out. Like my wife would be like really hysterical. Like, you let all these strangers in, and the house isn't clean enough, and
me too. I'm like, that seems unorthodox for some strange reason, maybe. But yeah, just all these people coming in. And it's interesting. She was an artist too, or is an artist, and that's why I guess that mixed media came into play when she started using Lucky's hair to put on paintings she made. So she also had paintings and interpretations, of course, of a lot of the other president's pets that she never met.
Yeah, and because I remember when you took over the collection, and we'll get to how I came into the museum in a little bit, but I remember going through the collection, and some of it were portraits that she had painted. Like, I remember there was one of Dolly Madison carrying a parakeet as the White House is burning, and she's escaping with the parakeet. And I don't know if under her other arm she had, like, the painting of George Washington or something, but, there were things like that. There were these vivid paintings that Claire had done. that are sort of interesting, and they sort of add to the quirky nature of the museum in general.
Yes, they were her way of telling the history and probably learning it in her mind so she could share it with people that were interested in the museum. And a lot of I believe the interviews she did, of course, she was featured on a lot of major news,
Good Morning America,
media publications and shows, etc. So those paintings were pretty, in my mind, strategic for her learning and conveying the history.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand it, and you have to learn it in a way that you can understand it and share it and tell it, and that's, I think, what she was doing there. So yeah, she had this museum, and then it moved into your hands, and I guess I sort of came to this in almost a roundabout way. Our producer Tricia was doing some work for you, and she was tasked with bringing in writers to work on the Presidential Pet Museum and maybe start a series of books, and that's how I got involved.
The first thing when we finally decided that I was going to take over the museum, Claire wanted to meet with me. I had only had a couple brief conversations on the phone with her and the gentleman that was on the digital side of it, and she is near DC. She still lives near DC now. Of course, she wanted me to come down there and get all the artifacts and everything, and I wanted to bring our producer, Tricia, with me because of her knowledge of writing and articulating so nicely to kind of document the transfer, if you will, the transfer of power, of whatever you want to call it. And we also brought a photographer with us to kind of document it because it was a big day in history, at least in my world.
So a big day in the history of the museum, too.
In the museum,
I mean, that needs to be...
I wanted Tricia to kind of write a passage, a book, or something along the lines about Claire, but Claire wasn't as receptive of that. That was funny because I thought she would love that, conveying some of the history, because she told us a lot of interesting stories that day, and I can't recall them all. We probably should have recorded it, but...
We should try and get her on the podcast.
Yeah, we should. We really should, because she's just... These stories are, again, mesmerizing. They're interesting, and she's got her own quirky way about her, just like the museum and myself. I have my own quirky way about me, but about saying it, and it makes it fun.
Yeah, and so I was brought in by Tricia after or around the time that you had this transfer of the museum, and it was initially more like, okay, we want you to write this book, pick one of the White House animals and write a book. And that was kind of the only direction I was given. And I ended up writing a book about old Ike, the tobacco-chewing ram that belonged to Woodrow Wilson. And I just thought that was so fascinating. I mean, first of all, like the idea that the ram is chewing tobacco, it just like blew my mind because, it's such a different time. Like now you would make sure your animal was never chewing tobacco, or, the idea that at the time, I guess the way... Well, let me start with, I'll talk a little bit about Ike, because me writing this book was kind of the equivalent of Claire doing those paintings. This is how I understand the animal and some of the presidential history. But, Woodrow Wilson during World War I sent his gardeners off to fight in the war effort. And it was sort of a show of austerity. Like, look, I'm going to bring sheep on to graze the White House lawns, and we won't have to have people mow it anymore. And we can save money because we all have to tighten our belts and, be frugal for victory. And they were having meatless Mondays and things like that. And so he brings these sheep, and there are all these sheep, and there's one ram, and that ram is Ike. Because he's the only ram, he sort of stands out. And at that time, all the reporters and people who visited the White House, politicians, so many of them were smokers. And there wasn't the concern about litter that we have today. People would just throw their cigar butts or their cigarette butts onto the White House lawn. And, of course, rams being rams, Ike started eating the cigar butts, and I guess he discovered the joys of nicotine from the cigar butts. And soon it became the case that if you were getting a cigar out of your pocket, he would come up and nudge you, and you needed to give him a cigar to chew on as well, because if you didn't, he would become more aggressive. And, rams can be kind of dangerous when they're aggressive. And so, it kind of went from there. And I thought that was such a fascinating story, and I think Wilson is a fascinating president. And one of the things that I learned when I was writing this book, which I didn't know before, I mean, I'd heard that he had had a stroke while in office, but I didn't know that essentially his wife ran the government or ran the executive branch of the government for months after his stroke.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, she kept this hidden from the public because if it got out there just how bad the president's condition was, then they would have removed him and put the vice president in place. And the vice president wasn't a very strong-willed person. He wasn't as strong-willed as Edith Wilson anyway. So very few people got to see the president. Congress didn't even really get to see the president, and they were starting to ask a lot of questions, but somehow she pulled this off. I mean, there are pictures of her. He's signing a bill and she's standing over his shoulder. And if you just look at it without knowing, you think like, oh, okay, this is just the wife watching the husband do something. If you know this story and you see this same picture, then it looks much more like he's this frail man and she's kind of coaching him through the process. Yeah. It was all staged. And
how long did this go on for?
I mean, it was a period of, I think it was at least 6 months or maybe even longer. It was near the end of his term. The fact that he had the stroke probably kept the League of Nations from passing because he wasn't there to fight for it and rally the public. And that has consequences that inevitably lead us to World War II. So this is a very pivotal moment in history. It's also, something that couldn't happen now. If a sitting president had a stroke now and wasn't able to make public appearances and wasn't going and Congress members weren't allowed in to see the person, there would be far more uproar and, there would be a much bigger to-do now than there was 100 years ago. I mean, that...
You could get away with stuff back then.
Yeah, and I think since then, we've had obviously more transitions of power due to illness and death of presidents in that time. You had Franklin Roosevelt dying in office. You had the Kennedy assassination. The idea of the vice presidency has really kind of changed since then as well. So that was interesting. But anyway, so I write this book, right? I write Old Ike, and I don't hear anything for a while. Like I turned in my manuscript, and I didn't hear anything for a few months, and then I got a call, and it was like, hey, we really like your book. We're going to work on publishing your book, but we need a historian for the museum. Are you interested? And, just being a guy who was, sitting at home, looking for something to do, somebody who political science was my major in college, and I had a minor in English. This was kind of a perfect job for me.
Right,
and it was in my wheelhouse. And of course, I didn't know you at the time. I don't think I even met you until I became the historian. So it was kind of, it was interesting becoming part of this whole process and getting exposed to the whole WoofDriver world. Kind of the ever-growing and expanding dog adventurer lifestyle that you lead. And, because it's almost like layers of an onion. Like we peel back a little bit of Bill and then there's more Bill and it just keeps... But that's been kind of fascinating. And I think beyond that, it's just been fascinating getting to know the stories of all these pets and sort of what they say about individual presidents. Because you can really see the personalities of the presidents with the animals that they chose to keep.
Totally. And that's with everyone today. That's fascinating to me. People have different breeds of dogs, different animals. What they chose to have a lot of time reflects their personality. So that's how, it ties together.
Well, and even with President Trump, who doesn't have any animals, I mean... I think
that says something too.
Yeah, I mean, it gets
good or bad. We don't take political sides here usually. We're the museum's kind of spread out amongst a lot of different political persuasions, which is nice because we can talk about things in a good manner, but the dogs and the animals kind of bring us all together because that's the central cause of the museum.
Yeah, I mean, I usually don't smack talk a president as a representative of the museum unless they've been out of office for at least 50 years. Like if you got to go back to Nixon, maybe. It's only been 45, but... like speaking of Trump, in a sense, it talks about his personality because he's he's a highly driven businessman, and that's the image he's cultivated for 40 years. And so, his image is all about prestige and, like $1,000 suits and all of these things. It's not about, you don't picture Donald Trump just in a T-shirt and shorts, like playing on the floor with a dog.
Right.
And that's never been the image he's tried to convey. Everything he does, is for a certain brand, right? And that's not his brand.
Sometimes they want presidents and political figures to get on the floor in the T-shirt and play with the dog to personalize themselves. They're handlers, the presidential handlers or political.
Yeah. The chief of staff might say, like, all right, we need a picture of you with a dog here.
Right. And I think if you look back in history, you can see some presidents with some animals, and you can see they look a little staged.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. And you,
for better or worse. I mean, I'm not judging per se.
Because there are pitfalls, right? If you are being totally natural with your animal. Lyndon Johnson was doing what he always did with his animals when he picked his dog up by the ears.
Very controversial.
There was a picture, yeah. I mean, it's an extremely famous picture, but it makes people so mad. I've had people tell me, like, that's why I hate Lyndon Johnson. And it's like, okay, I mean, that's fine. I mean, I always think about the Vietnam War, but, it's one of those things where he being an older person, I think he was born like 1905 or 1907 in rural Texas. I mean, this is a guy who grew up in the countryside. The relationship to animals at that time and in that place was very different from, somebody who is growing up in the suburbs or an urban area in 2019 or in the later part of the 20th century. And, would I pick my dog up by the ears? No. Do I think he should have done it? No. But I honestly think he thought he was doing something that the dog didn't mind, and, it was fun, and, that was just him being Johnson. He was kind of a larger-than-life character anyway. And, that became a bit of an issue for him, public relations-wise.
It's funny, and I'm not trying to get off topic here, but when you see, and I wouldn't pick a dog up by the ears, by the tail, anything like that, but just being the dog guy that I am, which I love dogs to the nth degree, but I watch my dogs, and they're more of a pack-oriented dog, and they play really hard because they're emulating what it would be like to chase prey in the wild and have to defend themselves or whatever. So a lot of that is play, but with purpose. And I've watched them actually drag each other. They've changed positions across my back patio by the tail.
Yeah.
So, and a veterinarian long said to me one long time ago, only a dog knows how to really play with another dog. Like, you wouldn't know what's going to hurt. We know certain things may hurt, but dogs know what buttons to push and how to approach play with them. So when you see that picture, again, I would never do it, and I wouldn't want to do it. It reminds me of grabbing a cat by the scruff.
Yeah.
It looks so cruel, but really that's the proper way, from my understanding with cats, to address a behavioral situation or take control of the situation. So I don't know enough about the ear aspect, but it's just, it seems like today people jump on everything, and we judge history through somewhat skewed lenses today.
Even in the 60s, it was a controversial thing. I mean,
it's
not like he got a free pass there, and now we're looking back at it and saying, like, holy crap. But Johnson, Johnson's like this larger-than-life character. I mean, it's not pet related, but one of my favorite stories about Johnson is he had a car that was a prototype, and it was amphibious. So he could drive the car, but it would float in water.
That's so interesting.
If he would bring these reporters down to his ranch while he was president, he'd bring these reporters to his ranch, and let's say, reporter Bill Helman had written this negative story about Johnson, criticizing him for something in the New York Times. He would say, okay, come on, Bill, let's go for a drive in my car. We're going to drive around the ranch. And he'd be driving him around, showing him things like, okay, here's where I did this, and here's where my father did that. And then at a certain point, he would go 50 miles an hour and drive right into a lake. And the reporter would be screaming. Yeah, the reporter would be screaming, and Johnson would be like, "This is what you get." And they'd get into the lake, and the car would float, and then the Johnson would just be laughing at this guy for nearly wetting himself. And again, think about a president doing that today.
Oh,
there was a very different relationship with the press back then. I mean, they kept things secret. I mean, reporters knew about Kennedy's affairs. They knew, they knew that Franklin Roosevelt was having an affair. But that was the kind of stuff you didn't talk about because this is the president, and the president.
Different world.
Yeah, the president deserves a certain amount of respect and secrecy. And it was also a different time in the way women were viewed and treated, and so probably a lot of those press guys were having affairs too, and they just saw this as like, okay, this is what a successful like alpha male guy does, and now we look at that and we say like, this is totally inappropriate, and you shouldn't be doing this, and it would come out, but it that kind of stuff didn't, till years later. But yeah, Johnson and his natural moment, that's a controversy. It's, sometimes when you're really yourself, if you don't like animals, people get upset. Harry Truman is reported to have said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. Somebody sent him a dog. Like, oh, Mr. President, here's a pet dog for you. The dog's name was Feller, and Truman was like, yeah, I don't want a dog. And he sent the dog off to live on a farm somewhere. And people were pissed. It was, the 1940s or early 50s, and they were mad. Like, why doesn't Truman want a dog? Why would he be so rude as to give this dog away? And what's the deal here? What kind of person doesn't like dogs? He just didn't like dogs. That was his natural thing, and I guess he wasn't going to play along just to play along. I think he did eventually allow his daughter to get another dog, so he could kind of be like, oh, no, look, I relented. We do have a dog around. But they just wasn't that kind of guy. He wasn't going to play the game, to get elected in that way. So,
they're an important part of our history and our lives, animals.
Yeah.
And you can see how it plays out back then, how it was playing out. And today, I think it's even more important because people understand how precious life is in so many regards. So animals are just so important.
Well, and then also, just look, if I were a press strategist working with a candidate, I would tell them, like, you get your dog an Instagram account, because that kind of stuff now, people love watching cat and dog videos on the internet.
Pence has the Bunny account, right?
Oh yeah, the Marlon Bundo Instagram account is really popular. Yeah, Mike Pence has a rabbit named Marlon Bundo. The closest thing we have to a first animal now. I think the Pences also have some dogs, if I'm not mistaken. But Marlon Bundo is the one that really kind of jumps out. One, because it's a rabbit, and that's kind of cool. And then the name. That's just a genius name.
Did they have that before they became vice president?
Yes, they had Marlon Bundo beforehand. He moved with them into the Naval Observatory where the vice president lives. He belongs, I think, to the daughter, to his daughter. I think it's Charlene Pence, and then the daughter, and then Karen Pence, the second lady, the vice president's wife, wrote a children's book about Marlon Bundo, and is sort of like following his dad around, or following around Mike Pence as a day in the life of the vice president. And of course, then that became not controversial per se, but the comedian John Oliver on HBO did a politically minded Marlon Bundo book where Marlon Bundo was gay, sort of playing on Pence's history of very conservative religious views regarding homosexuality and gay marriage. And so in John Oliver's book, the bunny finds a boyfriend and they get gay married, or I should just say married, really. But that's, it was kind of a direct one-to-one response. And the interesting thing is that both books raised money for charity, and awesome. Charlene Pence was saying, she was asked about it. Are you mad that they did this other book that's similar to your book at the same time to kind of poke at your dad? And she said, no, this is politics, this is America, this is free speech, and it's also like raising money for charity. And it's all based on the identity of my pet, which is awesome. Like if you want to take my pet and like raise money for charity and help people, great. And I think that's one of the things that I think when people have the right attitude about politics and their pets and sort of being a public figure, I really like that. I like the idea that, we can disagree and still respect each other, like still move forward and, still do good works for each other, for other people, even if we're on opposite sides of the issue. I mean, we're all just people trying to do what we think is best and to move the nation forward in the way that we think is
the pets can
possible.
provide a little bit of a buffer and possibly help, especially in today's tumultuous times where everyone's pretty divided.
Mm-hmm.
They can possibly, be a bridge and help buffer some of that, just like the rabbit was doing in so many ways, showing the different sides, and the Pences didn't mind. Also, we can learn a lot from animals, is my opinion. I mean, because of my adventurous ways with my dogs, I consider myself a dog trainer because the Husky's a tough breed to train, and I have to essentially train them to do a lot of the activities I want to engage in. And I learn a lot from them on a daily basis. So that can be applied to life, really, to my dealings with humans in a lot of ways. And the most important thing I think we learn sometimes is patience and not getting frustrated. And we're talking politics here. That can help us some with politics in the sense that because we all, I think today, again, we're divided. We want to be right. We want our candidate or our representatives to be for us and want them to be right. But sometimes it's about taking a little bit of patience. Like, you got to determine what's your dog trying to communicate. Well, listen to the other side once in a while and see what they're trying to say, because everybody deep down inside, I think, has the same goals. They want to have the best possible country for themselves and their families, of course. So it all can be it can be bridged by animals, really.
Well,
in my opinion.
And I think with most issues, you're going to have to do things incrementally.
Yes.
So you can't. You have to be willing to compromise, and
that's the best word of all.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be able to look at it and say, okay, I'm a liberal, but there are points where just like being 100% leftist doesn't work, or it goes too far, and there are things that conservatives bring up that are going to help put that in check and rein in the biggest excesses of the left. And it's the same thing the other way around.
Yes.
Like conservatives can go too far as well, and liberals need to help rein them in.
That's why I don't think any one party should rule. And it's when we have joint government, when we have everybody working together, it's when we shine, because you get the best of both worlds. Because there's so many different peoples represented that it's nice, because I think there's so many unintended consequences for every policy, and nobody can figure them all out. Sometimes they have not figured out until a policy or a law or something goes into effect, and you're like, wow, I didn't know that. But when you talk to the other side, they can bring up those unintended consequences sometimes before any damage is done. Yeah,
well, and that's... I think part of the problem with our political system now is that everything becomes about the next election cycle, right? So
yeah, it does.
So if I noticed this when Obama was president. I'm sure it's the same now. Like, the goal of the opposition party in Congress is to prevent a re-election of the current president.
So they don't want to work together with the current party because they want their president to get elected. Their party.
And if you look at the primary system and the way those things work, like, oh, you sided with the enemy on this one issue, and so therefore we're going to run a candidate against you who would never have done that. And so the primaries sort of encourage this, like, moving out from the center, because the people who vote in the primaries tend to be the most politically engaged in either party. So the people who are most vocal, usually most ideologically pure, right? So people who are more moderate don't always make it through the primary system.
Yeah.
And then one of those two more extreme versions of a party is going to get elected in the fall, and you end up then with you make people who aren't willing to compromise. And I know we're getting far afield here.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that, when we talk about the pets and we talk about how it humanizes people, I think that people on both sides of the aisle need to make sure they see the other people as human, as people who, yes, like you said, have the goal of making the country better for their family and for themselves and for everyone.
Yes.
And we can disagree on tax policy. We can disagree on defense spending. And like all of these things, there's not necessarily a right answer. It's a matter of finding balance and, maybe trying different things at different times. And you would hope that if pets are going to humanize people, that would eventually, start to rub off a little bit, and kind of help people work together. I don't know that the pets in and of themselves are strong enough to do this. We probably need some sort of cultural paradigm shift. We need to get away from cable news and angry Twitter rants and things like that.
Well, I think pets bring compassion to people. Their innocence and their the way they communicate requires us to think and to open up our heart in a lot of ways. And so I think it's a good start for us trying to get along politically.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to love George W. Bush to love Barney Bush. You don't have to love Obama or Barack Obama to love Bo Obama.
And the animals also bring kids into possible politics, young kids that might not have paid it attention, but it's not necessarily good for partisan bickering, but it's good to be interested. Wow, the president has the most beautiful dog, or whatever the case may be. So warm and fuzzy.
In the case of our museum, I mean, the kids can go back and they can see some of these far more exotic animals that people had, sort of prior to Franklin Roosevelt. There were a lot of exotic animals in and around the White House. Theodore Roosevelt had a badger in the White House. They made a little enclosure and kept this badger at the White House. He was on a campaign stop, I think it was in Kansas, and a little girl said to him, "Mr. President, would you like a badger?" And he said, "Yes, I would like a badger." And he wrote home to his son, I was given a badger, it bit me. Ha! Like he was excited that this thing bit him. Which, again, we were talking about how the pets sort of show the personality of the presidents, and I think that Teddy is a great example of that, because how many other presidents can you see keeping a badger? Not very many. You aren't going to, I can't imagine, like Gerald Ford hanging out with a badger at the White House. Gerald Ford had a golden retriever named Liberty who had puppies in the White House. And that seems like a very Gerald Ford type dog,
exactly.
Nice, steady, moderate dog, like Gerald Ford, nice, steady, moderately conservative president, he was trying to unite the country, and we can disagree about whether he should have actually pardoned Richard Nixon, but he did it for reasons of unification, not because he was corrupt or he was trying to maintain some kind of power or whatever else. And in his post-presidential career, I think he kind of demonstrated that. Same with Jimmy Carter. He's just a nice, decent guy. And again, you can disagree with him on policy. You can think that he wasn't strong enough militarily. But he's a decent guy, and he had these interesting pets. He had a cat named Misty Malarkey Yin Yang. He had dogs. Excuse me. Again, nothing crazy. You don't see Jimmy Carter with a badger in the White House. He's not a badger type guy. He's not adventurous and bold like Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt's policies were all adventurous and bold, and we're going to dig this canal. They say we can't dig a canal, but we're going to dig it. And that was kind of what he was known for.
We have, that reminded me, we have a coloring book. I don't think we've quite published it yet, but it's almost there, to show, especially to get more kids involved in all the different animals that were part of the presidencies along the way. And it'll be quite interesting, and I think adults might like doodling with it too.
Yeah, and actually I think the way the pictures are designed, they would be very good for the adult coloring book type folks. I know that's become a very popular thing now. It's a stress relief thing for a lot of folks. Yeah, you get a set of colored pencils and you keep them really sharp and you do these very intricate things. I was never good at coloring. I always, maybe it's because I'm blind. I mean, I wasn't legally blind as a kid, but my eyesight was always bad. But I also I didn't care about staying within the lines, which says something about my personality too, I guess. That's why I work for the Presidential Pet Museum.
Hey, wait a minute. What's my excuse now?
Yeah, look, I don't know. We can have your wife on as an interview guest, and we can ask her what your excuse is.
The secrets of WoofDriver.
Yeah, well, I mean...
Unleashed.
Honestly, that would be fascinating, but I'm pretty sure she's not going to do that. We'll have her here without you, so she can just be totally frank.
That's right. There you go.
But I think the pets show the personality of the person, or sometimes they just give us a better understanding of what a person was going through. One of my favorite stories is Andrew Johnson and his mice. The fact that when Johnson was being impeached, he had these mice that would come into his room and he would feed them flour and he wouldn't let his daughter exterminate them, and they were just living there in the White House. And I think Andrew Johnson's a terrible president. He was like a racist drunk, basically screwed up Reconstruction in a lot of ways. But, when I think of him like just this sad guy that is being impeached and nobody likes him in Washington, even the people who are defending him not because they think he's great, but just because they're trying to fight back against radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens. You have this guy like just making friends with mice. It kind of shows where he is in life, Most of us, if everything's going well, and no disrespect to mouse lovers out there, I know there are people with mice and rats as pets, and that's awesome. But most people, if it's a mouse that's in your house and chewing up the wall and things like that, you're going to have that mouse removed. But not Johnson, not then. No word that I know of as to whether he, took his little mice friends with him and moved back to Tennessee after his term was up in 1869. But that's for some historian, if you're listening, who knows that. Give me a call.
Yeah, anyone that ever our website actually. We've gotten people that have been neighbors to some of the presidents, at least to some of their animal handlers sometimes. I think someone contacted us about the Kennedy's horses or something. Mm-hmm. So if anyone's out there that has any relevant stories or interesting facts, please feel free to contact us. Historian at Presidential Pet Museum.
Yeah, historian at presidentialpetmuseum.com. That'll get you to me.
And Bill at WoofDriver.com will get you to me. You can, of course, email any of us.
We'll put those links in our description for this podcast.
We hope that one day, I don't know if we'll technically call it a podcast, but I haven't shared it with Andrew, but we do have the capabilities. People could call in, and possibly sometimes we can do a Q&A, because I know a lot of people have questions about some of the stuff we're saying, and we don't address their particular subject or question, whatever the case may be. So that might be fun to do sometime.
Yeah, and you can send us those emails too. If you have questions that you want us to address on our podcast, send it to us. We would love to hear from you, because we want to engage with you. And as far as shaping the museum, Bill is expanding the collection. You're getting a lot of press photos and artifacts and things that you can find. But I think if people are getting in touch with us and letting us know what they're interested in, that can help us to focus on different exhibits or maybe different artifacts that we might not otherwise have thought about.
Yes.
So a good example of artifacts we might not have thought about was. We did a convention not long ago of political memorabilia, and Brian, who does some work for the Presidential Pet Museum on occasion, was there with me, and he went around looking at buttons. He wanted to buy a Teddy Roosevelt for President button or something like that, and he ended up finding these postcards that showed William Howard Taft and his mascot, Billy Possum. And I'd never heard of Billy, and I looked on our website, and Billy wasn't on our website, but the interesting thing when I was doing my research on this was that Taft ate a possum at one point, and so his supporters were trying to replace the teddy bear, which had come from Teddy Roosevelt and was named after him and had been popular with children. And they thought, okay, we need the new fad. Instead of Tickle Me Elmo, we're going to have Billy Possum this year. That's the Christmas fad, and all the Taft supporters are going to get these Billy Possums, and it just didn't catch on. But that's one of those things, if you think about, how many kids have teddy bears now, where, you go to a baby shower, you buy a teddy bear to give to the expectant mother. We could have been giving possums. It could have been a very different story if the economy hadn't tanked on Taft. We could all, cuddle with possums as kids, and it could be the Billy Possum picnic instead of Teddy Bear's picnic, and things would be very different.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's a lot that we still would like to know and learn, and we're open and we're here if you know anything.
Great. We will be back next week. Any idea what we're going to do, our topic on?
I think we're going to be trying to talk about dog yoga, which is something that I know very little about, so I'm looking forward to researching it. And
we're trying to line up possibly to interview. On my WoofDriver Facebook page, I used to have someone doing live broadcast, two girls that were expert dog yoga people. So we're going to try to see if we can't get an interview with one of them. With the broadcast, nobody quite understood what was going on. It wasn't explained well, and we looked to do an interview to explain some of those dynamics, what's going on with it.
And heck, who knows? We could try to do dog yoga with my guide dog here and see if
or bring a couple goats in.
Oh, yeah, we could do goat yoga. Look, I would love to see this podcast become one where we occasionally are going out into the field and having adventures and just sort of seeing what happens. Like going on a dog adventure, going on a ghost hunt, doing goat yoga.
That's what I do. For those of you that don't know, I mentioned that I was a dog adventurer, but I'm out there usually 1 to 2 times a week doing extreme dog adventuring, meaning driving up and down the East Coast looking for trails that I haven't been to, exploring the history aspect with the dogs and running them on a bike-like sled. Additionally, I run them off-leash at farms and local area spots, but I'm always mingling with nature and adventure, and we could go out into the field. We hope to do some podcasts from the field and some different cool aspects and adventures along those lines.
One of my favorite ideas, and I don't know when we'll get to this, but it was the idea that you and I would go get one of those fish pedicures where you put your feet in the water and let the fish eat all the dead skin, and then we would just broadcast that live and talk about that.
I keep fish too because I'm an animal lover, like I said, but
you don't put the fish in the. I don't put your feet in the tank.
No, but I do have some stingrays, so they would probably.
That's probably You don't want.
As long as they didn't get me with their stingray, I might be okay.
Crikey! Sorry. That's anyway. But yes, thank you for listening to the WoofDen, and I'm Andrew Hager.
I'm Bill WoofDriver Helman.
And we will be back next week.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.